At 2:07 a.m., my phone lit up on the nightstand. I almost ignored it. At 52, I had learned that nothing good ever arrived in the middle of the night. But the name on the screen froze my breath. Madison Clark. The woman my husband left me for. My hands trembled as I opened the message. I know you hate me, but Richard is dying. The doctor said you're the only one who can save him. Please. For a long moment, I just stared at the words. 3 years ago, Richard Bennett walked out of our 27-year marriage because he said he deserved someone younger. Now the woman he chose over me was begging for my help. And the cruelest part, she was right. I might actually be the only person who could save his life. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If the person who broke your heart came back years later, desperate and helpless, would you help them? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if you're watching this story right now, take a second to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of it. I'm also curious, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Because what happened after that message at 2 a.m. changed everything I thought I knew about love betrayal and forgiveness. Before that message woke me up at 2:07 a.m., I hadn't spoken to Richard Bennett in nearly 3 years. Not since the day he stood in our kitchen holding a suitcase in one hand and the truth in the other and told me he didn't love me anymore. But to understand why Madison's message shook me the way it did, you need to understand the life Richard and I built together before everything fell apart. Because for a very long time, I believed we had something real, something unbreakable. I met Richard when we were both 22 years old at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He was studying business, always wearing wrinkled button-down shirts and talking about companies he dreamed of building someday. I was studying physical therapy, spending most of my time in labs and clinics, learning how to help people walk again after injuries. We couldn't have been more different. Richard was ambitious and loud, the kind of man who could walk into a room and instantly start a conversation with strangers. I was quieter, more practical, but somehow it worked. Our first date was nothing glamorous. We shared a cheap pizza at a small diner just off campus because that was all either of us could afford. I still remember how he talked about his future. Like it was already written. I'm going to build something big someday, he told me that night, his eyes bright with certainty. Not just a job, a company. I laughed and told him that if he ever did, I expected free remodeling for the house we didn't have yet. That was the beginning of everything. We got married 2 years later. Those first years of marriage were far from easy. Richard started a small construction company working out of a rented storage unit that barely fit a desk and 2 folding chairs. Most weeks we weren't sure if the business would survive. There were nights when Richard came home exhausted and covered in dust, collapsing onto the couch without even taking off his boots. There were months when our bank account dipped so low we had to choose between paying certain bills or buying groceries. But we faced it together. While Richard built his company, I worked long shifts as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic. My salary paid most of the early bills while his business slowly found its footing. And when I wasn't working at the clinic, I was helping him with paperwork, invoices, contracts, insurance forms. I didn't know anything about construction, but I knew how to organize chaos. Richard used to joke that I was the reason his company didn't collapse during those early years. You're the backbone of this whole operation, he would say, wrapping his arms around me after long nights at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork. Back then, I believed him. A few years later, our son Daniel was born. That was the happiest chapter of my life. Our house wasn't big, and Richard still worked too many hours. But when Daniel took his first steps across our living room floor, Richard dropped everything and lifted him into the air like he had just won the Super Bowl. For a long time, our life felt solid. Richard's construction company slowly grew from small home renovations to larger projects, office buildings, commercial renovations contracts that finally started bringing real money into our lives. We moved into a bigger house in the suburbs of Chicago. We bought our first new car. For the first time in years, it felt like we could breathe. But success changes people. I didn't realize it at first. The changes were small in the beginning. Richard started working later hours, attending more networking events, dinners with investors and clients. At first, I was proud of him. I thought it meant his business was thriving. Then the new suits appeared, the expensive watches. The sudden interest in things Richard used to roll his eyes at luxury cars, private clubs, expensive restaurants. When I asked about it, he always had the same answer. It's just business, Shirley. Image matters now. I told myself that was normal. Successful people had to maintain appearances. But gradually something deeper shifted. Richard stopped talking about the future the way he used to. The dreams we once shared slowly became his dreams alone. He traveled more. He answered calls in other rooms. He spent hours scrolling through his phone late at night. Sometimes I would wake up and find him downstairs staring at his laptop long after midnight. When I asked if something was wrong, he would smile and say everything was fine. But the distance between us kept growing. Daniel noticed it too. By the time Daniel was in college, Richard was rarely home for dinner. When he was, he seemed distracted, always checking messages or taking calls during the meal. One night, Daniel finally asked what I had been afraid to say out loud. "Mom, is Dad okay? He's different." I remember forcing a smile. "He's just busy," I said. "His company is growing." But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. The truth revealed itself in ways that seem obvious in hindsight. The late-night emails Richard quickly closed when I walked into the room. The sudden business trips that seemed to appear every other week. The new marketing department he hired at the company, something he had never needed before. At the time, I tried not to think about it. After 27 years of marriage, you don't want to imagine the worst. You tell yourself the person you built a life with would never betray you. You tell yourself love doesn't disappear overnight. But sometimes the signs are there long before we're ready to see them. The first time I heard the name Madison Clark, it meant nothing to me. Richard mentioned her casually during dinner one night. "We hired a new marketing consultant," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "She's helping with the company's branding." I nodded politely. "Sounds useful." He shrugged. "She's young, but she's sharp." At the time, it seemed like a normal business decision. After all, Richard's company was expanding. Hiring someone to manage marketing made sense. I didn't know then that the woman he mentioned so casually would soon destroy everything we had spent nearly 3 decades building together. If someone had told me that night that my marriage was already beginning to collapse, I wouldn't have believed them. Because the truth about betrayal is this: it rarely begins with a single moment. It begins quietly, slowly, like a crack forming in glass. And by the time you finally hear the shatter, it's already too late. Looking back now, that dinner conversation was the first ripple in a storm that would eventually tear my entire life apart. But at the time, I had no idea. To me, Madison Clark was just another employee at my husband's company. A name, a stranger. I couldn't have imagined that soon she would become the woman who replaced me. The first time I actually saw Madison Clark, it was at Richard's company holiday party. At the time, she was just a name I had heard once or twice in passing. The young marketing consultant Richard had mentioned casually over dinner months earlier. I hadn't thought much about it. After all, Richard's company had grown to nearly 50 employees by then. New faces appeared all the time. But that night, the moment I walked into the ballroom of the downtown Chicago hotel where the party was being held, I noticed her immediately. Not because she was doing anything inappropriate, not because she was standing too close to my husband, but because of the way Richard looked at her. After 27 years of marriage, you learn to read your spouse's expressions the way you read a familiar book. And the way he looked at Madison that night was not the way a boss looks at an employee. It was the way a man looks at someone he finds exciting. She was standing near the bar with a group of coworkers laughing about something someone had said. She was tall, maybe 5'8", with long blonde hair that fell over one shoulder, and the kind of effortless confidence that only young people seem to have. 27, I later learned, exactly 28 years younger than Richard. When Richard saw me walking toward him, he smiled and wrapped an arm around my waist. "Shirley," he said warmly, "I want you to meet someone." And just like that, the 3 of us were standing in a small circle beneath the glittering lights of the ballroom. "Madison Clark," Richard said, "this is my wife, Shirley." Madison turned toward me with a bright, polite smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said. "Richard talks about you all the time." Her voice was friendly, respectful. Nothing about the interaction felt inappropriate on the surface. But there was something else. Something small. Something almost invisible. The way Richard stood a little straighter beside her. The way Madison looked at him when she thought I wasn't watching. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my own insecurity. Maybe I was overthinking a perfectly normal conversation. After all, Madison had been nothing but polite. She asked about my work. She complimented Richard's company. She even laughed when Richard joked about how I was the organized one in our marriage. But later that night, when I was standing alone near the buffet table watching the room, I noticed something that stayed with me long after the party ended. Richard and Madison were standing across the room together. They weren't touching. They weren't even standing unusually close. But the way they leaned toward each other while talking made it clear they were completely absorbed in their own world. I remember feeling a strange tightening in my chest. Not jealousy exactly, just discomfort. The kind that makes you wonder if something is wrong but leaves you unable to explain why. When we got home that night, I mentioned it casually while Richard was loosening his tie. "That Madison seems nice," I said. Richard glanced at me briefly. "Yeah," he replied. "She's good at her job." Then he changed the subject. At the time, I let it go. But over the next few months, Madison's name appeared more and more often in Richard's conversations. Madison thinks we should redesign the company website. Madison helped land a new contract. Madison is putting together a marketing campaign. At first, it sounded like normal professional praise, but eventually I began noticing the way his tone changed when he talked about her. There was energy there, excitement, something that hadn't been present when he talked about work in years. Around that same time, Richard's schedule became busier than ever. He started traveling more frequently. Dallas, Denver, Los Angeles. Sometimes the trips only lasted a day or two. Other times, they stretched into a full week. Whenever I asked about them, he always had a reasonable explanation. Client meetings, site inspections, investor dinners. His business really was growing rapidly, so I had no reason to question it. Or at least that's what I told myself. The first crack in the illusion appeared on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had come home early from the clinic because one of my patients had canceled their appointment. Richard was supposed to be in Milwaukee that day for a meeting. But when I walked into the house, I noticed his laptop sitting open on the dining table. That wasn't unusual. Richard often forgot things when he rushed out the door. What caught my attention was the email notification on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop. I really wasn't. But the message preview was impossible to ignore. It read, "Last night meant more to me than you know." My stomach dropped. The sender's name appeared just below the message, Madison Clark. For a moment, I stood frozen in the doorway. My heart began pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe they had attended a company dinner. Maybe the message referred to a successful meeting or celebration. That's what I wanted to believe. But when I opened the email thread, the rest of the conversation removed any doubt. There were dozens of messages, some short, some long, some playful, some intimate in a way that had nothing to do with business. And the timestamps told the story clearly. Late-night conversations, private hotel stays, inside jokes. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. 27 years of marriage collapsed into a single unbearable realization. Richard wasn't just flirting with Madison. He was having an affair. When Richard came home that evening, I was waiting in the kitchen. The laptop sat on the table between us. He knew immediately that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked cautiously. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. Instead, I simply turned the laptop toward him. The email thread was still open. For several seconds, Richard stared at the screen. Then he sighed, not with guilt, not with shame, with annoyance, like a man who had just been caught in an inconvenient situation. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess there's no point pretending anymore." The calmness of his voice hurt more than the betrayal itself. How long, I asked. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, flat, distant. Richard leaned back in his chair. "About a year. 12 months of lies. 12 months of pretending everything was normal while he built a secret life behind my back." "Why?" I whispered. That was the moment I will never forget. Because instead of apologizing, instead of looking ashamed, Richard looked relieved, like a man who had finally been freed from something heavy. "Shirley," he said gently, "this isn't working anymore." I stared at him. "What isn't?" "This marriage." My chest tightened. "We've been together almost 30 years, I said. He nodded. "Exactly." There was a long silence before he continued. "You're a good person, Shirley, you really are. Whenever someone starts a sentence like that, you already know what comes next. But I feel like I've been living the same life for decades," he said. "Madison makes me feel alive again." The words hit me like ice water. "She's 27, I said quietly. Richard shrugged. So you're throwing away 27 years for someone half your age?" He shook his head slowly. "No." He looked directly at me when he said the next words. "I'm choosing a future that actually excites me." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The man sitting across from me didn't feel like the same person I'd spent most of my adult life with. And yet somehow he was. That night, Richard told me something else, something even more painful. "I think I deserve to be happy," he said, as if our entire life together had been a burden he had finally decided to put down. 3 months later, Richard filed for divorce. 6 months after that, he married Madison Clark. At the time, I thought that was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. I had no idea that, 3 years later, the woman he left me for would be the one begging for my help. Divorce is not just the end of a marriage. It is the dismantling of an entire life. When Richard filed for divorce 3 months after our confrontation in the kitchen, I still believed naively that fairness would somehow prevail. After all, we had been married for 27 years. I had supported him while he built his company. I had helped manage the paperwork in the early days. I had sacrificed time, sleep, and stability to make sure our family stayed afloat while he chased his ambitions. Surely that had to count for something. But I quickly learned that divorce, especially when large amounts of money are involved, is less about fairness and more about strategy. Richard hired one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in Chicago, a man named Grant Holloway who had a reputation for winning high-profile financial disputes. I remember the first time I saw him sitting beside Richard in the conference room during mediation. Grant was polished, confident, and completely ruthless. And from the way he looked at me, it was clear that to him, I wasn't a person. I was an obstacle. Richard's argument during the divorce proceedings was simple. Yes, we had been married for nearly 3 decades. Yes, I had supported him in the early years. But legally, the construction company was his business. It had been registered under his name. The investments had been structured through accounts I had never questioned at the time, which meant that when everything was examined through the cold lens of legal paperwork, my contributions became almost invisible. I sat through hours of meetings where lawyers discussed the life I had helped build as if it were a set of numbers on a spreadsheet. The house, the company, the savings, the assets. Every detail was dissected, and with each session it became painfully clear that Richard had prepared for this long before I ever discovered the affair. There were trusts I didn't know about, investment accounts that had been quietly moved, assets transferred under complicated legal structures. By the time the negotiations ended, the result was devastating. Richard kept the company. He kept the majority of the financial assets, and the house we had lived in for 15 years was sold. My share of the settlement was enough to survive, but nowhere near enough to maintain the life I had once believed was secure. The day I moved out of that house remains one of the hardest days of my life. I remember standing in the empty living room surrounded by cardboard boxes, looking at the bare walls where photographs had once hung. Daniel's childhood pictures, our family vacations, holiday decorations, memories that now felt like artifacts from another lifetime. Daniel was 22 at the time, finishing his last year of college in Chicago. When he came to help me pack, I could see the anger in his eyes. "Dad's making a huge mistake," he said, quietly, while sealing one of the boxes. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, I didn't know what to say anymore. For years, I had defended Richard whenever Daniel complained about how absent he had become. I had insisted that his father was simply busy building the future for our family. Now that future was gone. And the man I had spent half my life believing in had chosen someone else. Daniel hugged me before he left that evening. "You'll be okay, Mom," he said. I wanted to believe him, but at that moment, standing in the empty house, I wasn't sure. If the divorce itself had been painful, what followed afterward was even worse. The humiliation. News travels quickly in business communities like the one Richard had built around himself. Within weeks, everyone seemed to know what had happened. And like most stories, the truth was quickly twisted into something far simpler and far crueler. People whispered that Richard had upgraded, that his younger wife was better suited to the successful life he had created. Some even implied that the divorce was inevitable, that I had simply become too boring for a man who had outgrown his old life. I would see posts on social media showing Richard and Madison attending charity galas, business events, and lavish parties. Madison always looked radiant in the photographs. Elegant dresses, perfect smiles, her arm wrapped around Richard's. In one photo, they stood in front of a newly purchased home in the upscale Bellevue neighborhood near Seattle, holding glasses of champagne while friends congratulated them. Someone had commented below the picture, "Power couple." Another comment read, "Richard definitely traded up." I stopped looking at social media after that, but even without it, reminders of their new life seemed impossible to avoid. Mutual friends stopped calling. Some of them clearly chose sides. Others simply didn't know how to talk to me anymore. Divorce has a strange way of isolating people. Suddenly, the life you once shared with others becomes awkward territory, and gradually the invitations stop coming. For a while, I stayed in Chicago. I rented a small apartment not far from the rehabilitation clinic where I worked, but everywhere I went seemed filled with memories of the life that had just collapsed. The grocery store where Richard and I used to shop, the park where Daniel learned to ride his bike, the restaurant where we celebrated our 20th anniversary. Every corner of the city felt like a reminder of what I had lost. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Richard married Madison. It was a small ceremony on the coast of California. I didn't see the wedding, of course, but a colleague at the clinic mentioned it casually one afternoon, having read about it in a local business magazine. "Did you hear Richard Bennett remarried?" she asked. I nodded politely and changed the subject. That night I made a decision. I realized that if I stayed in Chicago, I would never truly move forward. Too many memories, too many ghosts. So I began looking for opportunities elsewhere. That's how Seattle entered my life. One of my former professors had moved there years earlier and now worked at a neurological rehabilitation center connected to a major hospital. When I reached out to him, he told me something that would quietly change the direction of my future. "There's growing demand here for specialists in spinal cord recovery," he explained during our phone call. "It's challenging work, but it can be incredibly rewarding." At the time, I wasn't thinking about career advancement. I was thinking about survival, about escape. Within 3 months, I packed everything I owned into a small moving truck and drove across the country. Leaving Chicago behind felt like stepping out of the ruins of my old life. Seattle greeted me with gray skies, rain-soaked streets, and a strange sense of anonymity that I desperately needed. No one there knew about Richard. No one knew about the divorce. No one looked at me with pity. I rented a modest apartment near Capitol Hill and began working at the rehabilitation center my professor had recommended. The work was difficult but meaningful. Many of my patients had suffered devastating injuries: car accidents, falls, sports trauma. People who were learning how to walk again. People rebuilding their lives from nothing. In many ways, they mirrored what I was going through myself. Healing isn't a single moment. It's a process. Slow, painful, uncertain. But little by little, both my patients and I began to move forward. What I didn't know at the time was that the path I had chosen in Seattle, the skills I was about to develop, the specialty I would eventually master, would one day lead me back to the man who had shattered my life. And when that day came, the woman he left me for would be the one begging for my help. When I first arrived in Seattle, I wasn't trying to build a new life. I was just trying to survive the ruins of the old one. The apartment I rented was small, barely more than 600 square feet, but it was quiet. It sat on the 3rd floor of a brick building near Capitol Hill with a narrow balcony that overlooked a street lined with maple trees. In Chicago, my mornings had always been loud. Construction trucks, city traffic, Richard talking on the phone before sunrise. In Seattle, my mornings began with rain tapping softly against the windows. For a long time, that quiet felt both comforting and painfully lonely. I started working at the Neurological Rehabilitation Center just 2 weeks after arriving. The clinic was connected to a large hospital network, and the patients who came through its doors often had some of the most severe injuries imaginable. Car accidents, falls from construction sites, motorcycle crashes, spinal cord trauma. At first, the work intimidated me. During my years as a physical therapist in Chicago, I had mostly treated sports injuries, post-surgery rehabilitation, and elderly patients recovering from hip replacements. Spinal cord injuries were different. The stakes were higher. Some patients came in unable to move their legs. Some had limited sensation in their hands. Some were facing the possibility that they might never walk again. But there was something about the challenge that pulled me in. Perhaps it was because I understood in my own way what it meant to rebuild a life from something broken. One of my first patients in Seattle was a 23-year-old college student named Marcus. Marcus had been in a snowboarding accident that left him with a severe spinal cord injury. When he arrived at the clinic, he could barely sit upright without assistance. The first time I met him, he looked at me with the kind of anger that only someone who has lost everything overnight can feel. "This is pointless," he told me during our first session. "I'm never going to walk again." I didn't argue with him. Instead, I said something that surprised even myself. "Maybe not today," I told him calmly, "but we're not working for today." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means we're working for 6 months from now, a year from now, maybe even 5 years from now." He didn't believe me. Most of my patients didn't, at least not in the beginning. Recovery from spinal cord injuries is painfully slow. Progress often comes in millimeters rather than miles. A small twitch in a muscle, the ability to sit without falling. The first time a patient can stand for 10 seconds using support bars, but those small victories add up. Over time, I began immersing myself completely in the field. I spent evenings reading medical journals and new research about neurological recovery. I attended workshops and seminars. I worked closely with neurologists and surgeons, learning everything I could about how the nervous system responds to trauma. The more I learned, the more fascinated I became. The human body is extraordinary. Even after devastating injuries, the nervous system sometimes finds ways to reroute signals, rebuild pathways, and recover functions that once seemed permanently lost. It's not magic, it's patience, discipline, and relentless effort. About a year after arriving in Seattle, I made a decision that changed my career. Instead of remaining a general physical therapist, I specialized completely in spinal cord rehabilitation and neurological recovery. It required additional certifications and training, but I was determined. My colleagues began referring the most complex cases to me. Patients who had been told elsewhere that their chances of improvement were minimal. Patients who needed months, sometimes years of careful therapy. One of those patients was Marcus. For nearly 8 months, we worked together almost every day. There were moments when he wanted to quit. Moments when progress seemed non-existent. Moments when frustration turned into tears. But one afternoon, something happened that neither of us will ever forget. Marcus was standing between the parallel bars during a therapy session. His legs trembled under the strain. I stood beside him, ready to support him if he lost balance. "Okay," I said gently. "Shift your weight forward." He tried. His legs shook harder. "I can't," he said through clenched teeth. "Yes, you can." For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his right foot moved forward. One step. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't strong. But it was real. Marcus stared down at his foot as if it belonged to someone else. Then he looked up at me. "Did I just—" "Yes," I said, smiling. "You just took your first step." That moment changed something inside both of us. For Marcus, it was the beginning of hope. For me, it was confirmation that I had found my purpose. Word about my work began to spread through the hospital network. Doctors started referring more patients to the clinic, specifically asking for me. Some of them had been told their injuries were too severe for meaningful recovery. Others simply wanted to try everything possible before giving up. 2 years after moving to Seattle, I left the hospital clinic and opened a small private rehabilitation practice focused entirely on neurological recovery. It wasn't a large facility, just 3 treatment rooms, a small gym area with specialized equipment, and an office with a window that overlooked a quiet street. But it was mine, and slowly it began to grow. Patients came from all over Washington. Some even traveled from neighboring states after hearing about the work we were doing. For the first time since the divorce, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stability, confidence, a sense that my life had direction again. By the time the 3rd year in Seattle began, my days had settled into a steady rhythm. Morning patient sessions, afternoon therapy programs, evenings reviewing case notes and planning treatment strategies. My son Daniel visited whenever he could, though he had started building his own life in Chicago. And most importantly, something else had changed. Richard Bennett had slowly faded from my thoughts. In the beginning, memories of him had been impossible to escape. But over time, they lost their power. I stopped wondering what he was doing, stopped thinking about the life he had chosen with Madison, stopped imagining what their world looked like. In my mind, that chapter had closed. The man who had once been my husband was now simply part of a past I had survived. That's why when my phone lit up at 2:07 in the morning 3 years later, I never expected to see the name that appeared on the screen, Madison Clark, and the message that followed. "I know you hate me, but Richard is dying." What I didn't realize in that moment was that everything I had learned in Seattle, Every patient I had helped, every skill I had spent 3 years developing, was about to pull me back into the life I thought I had left behind forever. For 3 years, Richard Bennett existed only as a distant memory. Not a pleasant one, but no longer a painful one either. Time has a strange way of dulling the sharpest wounds. What once felt like an open cut eventually becomes a scar still visible, still real, but no longer bleeding. By the 3rd year of my life in Seattle, I rarely thought about him at all. My days were too full. Running a rehabilitation clinic turned out to be far more demanding than I had imagined when I first opened the practice. Patients arrived early in the morning, many of them traveling hours just to attend therapy sessions. Some were hopeful, some were terrified. Some had already been told by other doctors that improvement was unlikely, but they came anyway, because sometimes hope lives in the smallest possibility. My clinic had grown steadily. What started as a tiny practice with a handful of patients had become a respected rehabilitation center. I had hired 2 additional therapists and a receptionist to help manage the growing demand. Every week brought new cases: a construction worker recovering from a crushed vertebra, a mother of 2 who had lost mobility after a car accident, a retired firefighter rebuilding strength after spinal surgery. Each story was different, but they all shared one thing in common. They were fighting for their lives to move forward again. In many ways, working with those patients had helped me heal my own wounds, because every day I watch people rebuild themselves after unimaginable losses. And if they could do that physically, then surely I could do it emotionally. Occasionally, Richard's name surfaced indirectly. Chicago was still connected to my life through Daniel, who had decided to remain there after finishing college. He had started working for a logistics company and seemed determined to build his own path independent of his father's influence. Daniel rarely spoke about Richard. Their relationship had cooled significantly after the divorce, but sometimes small details slipped into conversation. Dad expanded the company again, Daniel mentioned once during a phone call. Another time he said they bought a bigger house out in Bellevue. I never asked for more information, and Daniel seemed relieved that I didn't. From what little I heard, Richard's life appeared to be thriving. His construction company had grown into a major regional business. He and Madison attended charity galas and corporate events. They were often featured in business magazines and social media posts as a successful couple. Once, a patient mentioned his name casually while describing a commercial building project in Chicago. Bennett Construction handled the whole project, the patient said. That guy must be worth a fortune. I simply nodded and continued the therapy session. I didn't feel anger anymore, but I also didn't feel curiosity. Richard Bennett belonged to another lifetime, one I had no desire to revisit. My own life had become quiet, stable, loungy, and most importantly, my own. My mornings began early. I usually arrived at the clinic before 7, reviewing patient charts while drinking coffee from the small cafe across the street. By 8, the first therapy sessions began. The gym area filled with the sounds of rehabilitation equipment, metal bars, clinking exercise bands, stretching footsteps, slowly testing strength and balance. Every patient carried their own story of loss and determination. Sometimes those stories followed me home at night, but more often they reminded me of how resilient people can be, even after everything they have lost. One particular afternoon near the end of a long week, I sat in my office finishing paperwork while rain tapped softly against the windows. Seattle rain has a rhythm that becomes strangely comforting once you live here long enough. Steady, calm, predictable. It was a far cry from the chaos my life had once been. That night, I left the clinic later than usual. The streets were quiet as I drove back to my apartment. Most of the city had already settled into sleep. By the time I got home, it was nearly midnight. I made a cup of tea, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat on the couch scrolling through patient notes on my tablet. Eventually, exhaustion won. I turned off the lights and went to bed. For several hours, the world remained peaceful, until my phone lit up on the nightstand. 2:07 a.m. The sound of the notification pulled me out of sleep slowly. For a moment, I stared at the ceiling, trying to decide whether the message was important enough to check. Most of the time, late-night messages were simple things. Appointment cancellations, automated reminders, occasionally Daniel calling if something urgent had happened. But when I reached for the phone and saw the name on the screen, my entire body froze. Madison Clark. For several seconds, I thought it must be some kind of mistake. Why would Madison contact me? We hadn't spoken since the day I met her at Richard's holiday party years ago. After the divorce, our lives had separated completely. Yet there her name was, glowing on the screen in the dark room. My heart began to beat faster. Slowly, I opened the message. It contained only one sentence. "I know you hate me, but Richard is dying. The doctors say you're the only one who might be able to help him." For a moment, I couldn't move. The words blurred together as my mind tried to process what I was reading. Richard is dying. The man who had always seemed larger than life, confident, successful, untouchable. I read the message again, then a third time. Each time it felt more surreal. My first reaction wasn't sadness. It was disbelief. And beneath that, something darker. A complicated mix of old anger and confusion. Why would she contact me? There were thousands of doctors in the country. Hundreds of rehabilitation specialists. Why me? As if reading my thoughts, another message appeared. "He had an accident," Madison wrote. "A car crash 3 weeks ago. Severe spinal cord injury. The doctors say recovery is unlikely." My chest tightened. Spinal cord injury? The words carried enormous weight in my world. They were the injuries my entire career now revolved around. Then the final message arrived. "One of the neurologists here mentioned your name, Shirley Sanchez. He said you're one of the best specialists in neurological rehabilitation." I sat up slowly in bed. Madison continued typing. "Richard doesn't know I'm contacting you." A pause. Then the last line. "But if anyone can help him walk again, it's you." The room felt suddenly very small. 3 years earlier, Richard had walked away from our marriage because he said he deserved a new life. Now the life he had chosen was falling apart. And somehow, fate had twisted our paths together again in the cruelest possible way. I stared at the phone screen for a long time. My mind raced through memories I thought I had buried. The kitchen conversation, the divorce, the humiliation, the photographs of Richard and Madison celebrating their new life. For 3 years, I had worked hard to leave that chapter behind. And now, in the middle of the night, the woman who had replaced me was asking for my help. Not just help, salvation. Because if what she was saying was true, then Richard Bennett, the man who once believed he deserved a better future without me, was now facing a future where he might never walk again. And somehow, the only person who might be able to change that was the wife he left behind. I didn't reply to Madison's message right away. Instead, I set the phone down on the nightstand and stared into the darkness of my bedroom. For 3 years, I had carefully built a life that didn't include Richard Bennett. I had buried the anger, the humiliation, the betrayal under layers of work and routine. And now, in the span of 3 text messages, everything had come rushing back. Richard is dying. The words echoed in my mind, heavy and strange. Part of me wanted to ignore the message completely. After everything he had done, after the lies, the divorce, the way he had walked out of 27 years of marriage as if it meant nothing. Why should I care what happened to him now? But another part of me couldn't dismiss it so easily. Because what Madison described wasn't just an illness. It was a spinal cord injury. And that meant something very specific. I knew exactly what kind of future Richard might be facing. Paralysis, loss of independence, months or years of rehabilitation, or possibly no recovery at all. I had seen patients confront that reality countless times in my clinic. I had watched strong, confident people break down when they realized their bodies would never function the same way again. And I knew how devastating that moment could be. Still, none of that answered the question that kept circling through my mind. Why me? Seattle had hundreds of rehabilitation specialists. Across the country, there were thousands. Why would a neurologist suggest Shirley Sanchez of all people? I reached for the phone again and reread Madison's messages. 3 weeks since the accident. Severe spinal cord injury. Unlikely recovery. My mind immediately began analyzing the situation the way it always did when I heard about a new patient. What level of injury? Cervical, thoracic, lumbar. Each one carried different implications. Each one changed the entire trajectory of rehabilitation. Before I realized what I was doing, I had already typed a reply. What hospital? For several minutes, there was no response. I wondered if Madison had fallen asleep or if she had lost the courage to continue the conversation. Then my phone buzzed again. Harborview Medical Center, she wrote. That made sense. Harborview was one of the largest trauma hospitals in the Pacific Northwest. Severe accident cases from across the region were often transferred there. Another message appeared almost immediately. The neurologist who mentioned you is Dr. Nathan Cole. I sat up straighter. Dr. Nathan Cole. I knew that name. Nathan Cole was one of the most respected neurologists in the state. Over the past year, he had referred several complex spinal injury cases to my clinic. We had worked together closely on rehabilitation plans for some of those patients. If he had suggested my name to Richard's doctors, it wasn't random. It meant he believed I could help. The realization made the situation even more surreal. Somewhere inside Harborview Medical Center, Richard Bennett, the man who once claimed he deserved a better life without me, was lying in a hospital bed with a spinal cord injury. And one of the leading neurologists in the region had recommended his ex-wife as the best chance for recovery. My phone buzzed again. "Please," Madison wrote. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but he's only 55. He's not ready for his life to end like this." I exhaled slowly. The strange thing was, Madison's message didn't sound arrogant or defensive. It sounded desperate. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what the last 3 weeks might have looked like for her. The accident. The hospital. Doctors explaining the diagnosis. Tests. Surgery. Waiting rooms. Fear. No matter how complicated our history was, Madison was still a woman watching the man she loved struggle to survive. And that kind of fear makes people do things they never expected. I typed another message. "What exactly happened?" This time the reply came quickly. "Car accident. He was driving back from a meeting in Tacoma. It was raining. The car hydroplaned and hit the guardrail." A pause. Then another message. "He broke several vertebrae in his lower spine." Lower spine. That suggested a lumbar injury or possibly lower thoracic. Better than cervical. Still serious. Still potentially life-changing. But not necessarily hopeless. My mind had already shifted fully into professional mode. What imaging had been done? Was there spinal cord compression? Had surgery stabilized the vertebrae? Was there any motor function remaining in the legs? Each of those details would determine the realistic chances of recovery. Madison must have sensed my hesitation because another message appeared. "Dr. Cole said the surgery was successful, but Richard still can't move his legs." My chest tightened. Paralysis immediately after surgery wasn't unusual. But the longer it lasted, the harder recovery became. Then came the message that made everything even more complicated. "Richard doesn't know Dr. Cole contacted you before. He doesn't know I'm messaging you now." I frowned at the screen. "Why not?" I asked. Several seconds passed before the response came. "Because he would never agree to it." That answer didn't surprise me. Richard Bennett had always been a proud man. Too proud sometimes. The idea that the woman he abandoned might become the one responsible for helping him walk again would be difficult for him to accept. Another message appeared. "He still thinks you're in Chicago." I leaned back against the headboard. Of course he did. Richard had never been particularly interested in the details of my life once our marriage ended. He probably assumed I had simply continued working at the same clinic. He had no reason to imagine that I had moved across the country, built a new career, and become a specialist in the exact field that now determined his future. The irony was almost unbelievable. For a moment, I considered the simplest solution. I could decline, politely, professionally. There were plenty of other therapists who could work with Richard. I could wish them well and return to the quiet life I had built here. No complications. No emotional chaos, no reopening old wounds. But then I thought about the patients I had treated over the past 3 years. Marcus, the construction worker who regained the ability to walk after months of therapy. The firefighter who relearned how to climb stairs. The young mother who cried the first time she stood up again after her accident. Every one of them had come to my clinic because someone believed I might be able to help. And I had never turned a patient away because their past was complicated. My work had never been about personal feelings. It had always been about possibility. Still, this situation was different, because this wasn't just another patient. This was the man who had once shattered my life. My phone buzzed again. Madison had sent one final message. "I know you owe us nothing, but if there is even a small chance you can help him, please." I stared at the words for a long time. Then slowly I made my decision, not as Richard's ex-wife, not as the woman who had been betrayed, but as the specialist I had spent the last 3 years becoming. I typed a short reply. "I'll come to the hospital tomorrow." A few seconds later, Madison responded. "Thank you." I set the phone down again and lay back against the pillow. Sleep didn't return easily that night, because by morning I would walk into Harborview Medical Center. And for the first time in 3 years, I would see Richard Bennett again. Only this time everything would be different. The next morning, Seattle looked exactly the way it often does in early spring. Gray skies hanging low over the city, the streets still damp from overnight rain. But inside my chest, nothing felt calm. I arrived at my clinic earlier than usual, though I knew I wouldn't be seeing patients for most of the day. My mind was too occupied to focus properly, and the last thing I wanted was to make mistakes during therapy sessions. After speaking briefly with my staff and rearranging a few appointments, I grabbed my coat and headed toward Harborview Medical Center. The drive across the city felt strangely unreal. 3 years. That's how long it had been since I had seen Richard Bennett in person. 3 years since the divorce hearings, the lawyers, the empty house in Chicago. 3 years since he walked out of my life with the certainty that he had chosen something better. And now I was driving toward a hospital where he lay injured, possibly facing the kind of physical limitations that could change the rest of his life. The irony of it all felt almost too sharp to process. Harborview was already busy when I arrived. Ambulances lined the emergency entrance. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through the corridors with the focused urgency that only trauma hospitals seem to possess. Inside the lobby, the smell of disinfectant and coffee filled the air. I walked toward the elevators, slowly feeling the familiar shift that always happened when I entered a hospital environment. Part of my brain switched automatically into professional mode. Observe, analyze, stay calm. Emotion could come later. When the elevator doors opened on the neurological trauma floor, I spotted Madison almost immediately. She was sitting alone in the waiting area, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, staring at the floor. For a moment, I barely recognized her. The Madison I remembered from the company holiday party years earlier had looked polished and radiant, perfect hair, confident posture, the kind of effortless beauty that makes people turn their heads. The woman sitting in front of me now looked exhausted. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, strands falling across her face. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and her shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the last few weeks had pressed down on her constantly. When she looked up and saw me approaching, she stood quickly. For a second, neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other. The two women whose lives had been tangled together by the same man. Finally, Madison broke the silence. "Shirley?" Her voice sounded hesitant, almost uncertain. I nodded. Yes. Up close, she looked even more worn than she had from across the room. Stress has a way of aging people quickly. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. I could hear genuine relief in her voice. Not triumph, not awkwardness, just relief. I folded my arms gently, keeping my tone neutral. "How is he?" Madison exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding that question inside for hours. "The surgery stabilized his spine," she said, "but he still can't move his legs." That confirmed what I had suspected from her messages. "Has Dr. Cole spoken with you?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "He said the spinal cord wasn't completely severed, but there's severe damage. The swelling hasn't fully gone down yet." That was important information. Incomplete spinal injuries sometimes allowed for partial recovery. But the road back was unpredictable. Madison hesitated before continuing. "He said rehabilitation will determine a lot of what happens next." I nodded slowly. "That's true." For a moment we stood there in silence again. Then Madison glanced toward the hallway that led to the patient rooms. "He's awake," she said softly. My chest tightened. I had prepared myself mentally for this moment during the drive, but standing just a few feet away from the man who had once been my husband suddenly felt far more complicated. "Does he know you contacted me?" I asked. Madison shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice dropped slightly. "I didn't tell him." "Why not?" She hesitated. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Because he's ashamed." The answer caught me off guard. Madison continued quietly. "He doesn't say it out loud, but I can see it." She glanced down at her hands. "Richard has always been the one in control, the one fixing problems, running the company, making decisions. Now he can't even sit up without help." She looked back at me. If he knew the doctor recommended his ex-wife to help him walk again, I don't think he could handle it right now. I considered her words carefully. Pride. Richard had always had plenty of it. Perhaps too much. "Where is Dr. Cole?" I asked. "He's finishing rounds," Madison said, "but he knows you're here." I nodded. "Good." Professional protocol required that I speak with the attending neurologist before evaluating any patient. But even without seeing Richard yet, I could already feel the emotional tension building inside me. Because no matter how much I tried to approach this situation like a normal medical consultation, it wasn't normal. Madison must have sensed my hesitation. "Shirley," she said gently. I looked at her. "I know this is strange." Strange was one way to describe it. "You don't owe us anything," she continued. "If you decide you can't do this, I'll understand." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. I just didn't know who else to ask. Something in her expression shifted then. The arrogance I had once imagined her possessing was completely gone. This was simply a woman trying to save someone she loved. At that moment, a familiar voice spoke behind us. "Shirley." I turned to see Dr. Nathan Cole approaching down the hallway. He was exactly as I remembered him. Tall, silver-haired, wearing the calm expression of someone who had spent decades dealing with medical crises. "Dr. Cole," I said, extending my hand. He shook it firmly. "I'm glad you came." "So am I replied. Madison stepped aside slightly as we spoke. "Richard Bennett's injury is complicated," Dr. Cole said. "The spinal damage is severe but not complete. There's still potential for recovery if the right rehabilitation program is implemented." I nodded. "That's encouraging. But it won't be easy," he added. "The window for neurological recovery is limited, especially in the first year after trauma." That much I already knew. "What level of injury?" I asked. "Lower thoracic," he said, T11. That explained the paralysis in Richard's legs. But it also meant his upper body function should remain intact, better than a cervical injury. Still difficult, but potentially manageable. Dr. Cole studied my face carefully. "I realize the personal history here makes things complicated," he said quietly. I gave a small smile. "That's one way to put it." "But professionally speaking," he continued, "you're one of the best specialists in neurological rehabilitation in this region." The compliment felt strange given the circumstances. "Richard will need someone who understands how to push him without breaking his motivation," Dr. Cole said. He glanced toward the hallway leading to Richard's room, "and someone he'll eventually trust." I followed his gaze. For the first time since arriving, the reality of the moment settled fully into my chest. Just beyond that hallway, the man who had once been my husband was lying in a hospital bed. The man who believed he deserved a better life without me. Now that life had collapsed in ways neither of us could have predicted, Dr. Cole looked back at me. "Would you like to see him?" I took a slow breath. 3 years ago, Richard Bennett had walked out of our marriage with confidence. Today, he couldn't walk at all, and somehow fate had placed me back in his life again. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think it's time." The hallway leading to Richard's hospital room felt longer than it probably was. Hospitals have a way of stretching time. Every step echoes slightly against polished floors. Every door holds a story of someone fighting for their life in one way or another. As I walked beside Dr. Nathan Cole, I could feel Madison following a few steps behind us. None of us spoke. The silence felt heavy but necessary. Part of me wondered what Richard looked like now. The last time I'd seen him, he had been standing confidently in a courtroom hallway outside the divorce hearing, dressed in an expensive suit, his posture straight and unshaken. He had looked like a man who had already moved on. Now he was lying in a trauma ward. Dr. Cole stopped in front of a door near the end of the corridor. "Room 417. He turned slightly toward me before opening it. "I'll give you both a moment to observe before we discuss treatment options," he said quietly. I nodded. Then he pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit with soft afternoon light filtering through the window. For a second, I didn't immediately recognize the man lying in the hospital bed, not because his face had changed dramatically, but because everything about him seemed smaller, weaker. Richard Bennett had always carried himself like someone who owned every room he entered. Even during difficult conversations, there had been a certain confidence in the way he spoke, the way he moved. The man lying in front of me now looked diminished. His shoulders were slightly slumped against the raised hospital bed. A thin blanket covered his legs, though I knew those legs could not feel much beneath the fabric. His hair, once neatly styled, had grown unevenly during the weeks he had been in the hospital. But it was his eyes that struck me the most. They were open, staring toward the window with a distant focus. A nurse stood near the bedside adjusting an IV line. She nodded politely as we entered and quietly left the room. For a few seconds, Richard didn't notice us. Then Madison stepped forward. "Richard." His head turned slowly toward her. "Hey," he said. His voice sounded weaker than I remembered. Still familiar, but tired. Madison moved closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" Richard gave a faint, humorless smile. like a guy who just got hit by a truck. That sounded like the Richard I remembered, deflecting discomfort with sarcasm. Madison sat down beside the bed. Dr. Cole stopped by earlier, she said. Richard nodded slightly. Yeah, he told me the same thing again. And what's that? She asked gently. That recovery is uncertain. He glanced toward the blanket covering his legs. Apparently my legs didn't get the memo that they're supposed to work. His tone carried a bitterness that I had heard many patients express during the early stages of spinal trauma. Denial, frustration, fear. Madison reached for his hand. We're still exploring options. Richard exhaled slowly. I know. Then his eyes moved across the room and finally landed on me. At first his expression was simply confused, like someone trying to recognize a face in a crowd. But within seconds, confusion turned into shock. Shirley. The name left his mouth almost like a reflex. For a moment, the room fell completely silent. I stood near the doorway, unsure how close to approach. Yes, I said calmly. Richard blinked several times, as if trying to convince himself I was actually standing there. What are you doing here? His voice carried a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Madison shifted slightly in her chair, but didn't speak. I stepped forward slowly. Dr. Cole asked me to come by. Richard looked at Madison, then back at me. Understanding slowly dawned on his face. You called her? He asked Madison. Madison lowered her eyes briefly. I thought she might be able to help. Richard let out a quiet breath somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Of course. His pride had been wounded. I had expected that. This is ridiculous, he muttered. His eyes returned to me, searching. You're a physical therapist, Shirley. Why would they call you for something like this? I crossed my arms gently. Because spinal cord rehabilitation is my specialty now. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You specialize in that? Yes. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. 3 years of distance sat between us like an invisible wall. Finally, he spoke again. You moved to Seattle? Yes. And you opened your own practice? Yes. Richard looked genuinely surprised. It occurred to me then that he probably hadn't thought much about my life after the divorce. In his mind, I had likely remained the same woman he left behind in Chicago. Quiet, predictable, unchanged. Reality had apparently taken a different path. Dr. Cole stepped forward, slightly breaking the tension. Mr. Bennett, he said calmly, I asked Shirley to come today because she has extensive experience in spinal cord rehabilitation. Richard shifted slightly in the bed. So she's my doctor now? Not exactly, Dr. Cole replied, but she would be responsible for designing and guiding your rehabilitation program if you choose to proceed. Richard looked down at his legs again. The blanket rose and fell slightly with his breathing. Rehabilitation, he said quietly. The word carried weight, because rehabilitation meant confronting the reality of his injury. It meant months, possibly years of painful work, and it meant accepting help. Something Richard had never been good at. I'm not even sure I can move my legs again, he said after a moment. Dr. Cole responded carefully. The injury is severe, but not complete. There is still potential for recovery. Richard laughed softly. That sounds like a doctor's way of saying, maybe, maybe not. Recovery after spinal trauma is unpredictable, Dr. Cole admitted. But the right rehabilitation program can make a significant difference. Richard's eyes drifted toward me again. You're telling me my ex-wife is now the person who's supposed to help me walk? There was no anger in his voice, just disbelief. I met his gaze steadily. I'm telling you that I've spent the last 3 years helping people recover from injuries like yours. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. I didn't know that. That's understandable, I replied calmly. A small, uncomfortable silence filled the room. Then Richard looked toward the window again. I guess life has a strange sense of humor, he murmured. Madison squeezed his hand gently. Shirley didn't have to come here, she said softly. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the ceiling as if weighing something internally. Finally, he spoke again. So what happens now? Dr. Cole answered. Now we evaluate your neurological response and determine the best rehabilitation plan. Richard's gaze shifted back to me. And you're willing to help with that? The question hung in the air. 3 years of history sat behind it. The marriage, the betrayal, the divorce, everything. I took a slow breath. Then I answered honestly. I'm willing to evaluate your condition. Richard nodded slightly. That was enough for now. Because in that moment, the past and the present had finally collided. And whether either of us liked it or not, our lives had just crossed paths again. For the next hour, the situation shifted from emotional to clinical. That transition was necessary. If I allowed my personal history with Richard to dominate the moment, I wouldn't be able to do my job properly. Years of working in rehabilitation had taught me something important. Patients don't need therapists who are emotionally tangled in their circumstances. They need professionals who can stay calm, focused, objective. So I stepped closer to the bed and pulled a chair beside Richard. "All right," I said gently. "Let's start with some basic assessments." Richard gave a faint smile. "You always did go straight to business." I ignored the comment and turned to Dr. Cole. "Can you summarize the surgical results?" Dr. Cole nodded. The vertebral fractures were stabilized with hardware. The spinal cord was compressed, but not severed. Most of the swelling has started to decrease, but motor function hasn't returned yet. That matched the medical reports Madison had described earlier. I looked back at Richard. "I'm going to test a few things," I explained. "Muscle response, sensation, reflexes." He shrugged slightly. "Go ahead." I began with the simplest evaluation. "Try to move your right foot." Richard stared down at the blanket covering his legs. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then he shook his head. Nothing. I wasn't surprised. Immediately after spinal trauma, movement often disappears completely, even if nerve pathways remain partially intact. "Okay," I said calmly. "Now tell me if you can feel this." I lightly touched the top of his foot through the blanket. Richard frowned. "Barely. Where exactly?" He hesitated. "Maybe near my ankle." That was actually encouraging. Even limited sensation meant the spinal cord still carried some signals. Dr. Cole made a note on his tablet. I continued the evaluation. Knee reflex tests, light pressure along the legs, muscle response checks. The entire process took nearly 40 minutes. By the end, Richard looked exhausted, but the results gave me a clearer picture. When I finally leaned back in the chair, Dr. Cole studied my expression. "Well," he asked. I paused for a moment before answering. "There's still neurological activity below the injury site." Richard's head turned quickly toward me. "That's good, right? It means recovery is possible," I said carefully. "Possible," he repeated. Madison leaned forward slightly. "So he could walk again." I chose my words carefully. "Potentially." Both of them watched me closely now. Incomplete spinal injuries sometimes allow the nervous system to reestablish partial pathways, I continued, but it requires extremely consistent rehabilitation. Richard looked skeptical. "What kind of rehabilitation?" I folded my hands together. "The kind that takes months, sometimes years." Silence filled the room again. Madison spoke first. "But there's still a chance." "Yes." Richard let out a slow breath. "Define chance." That was the hardest question to answer, honestly. "Based on what I've seen today, I said I would estimate somewhere between 30 and 40%. Madison's face brightened slightly, but Richard frowned. "That doesn't sound very encouraging." "Recovery from spinal injuries rarely is," I replied calmly. I had learned long ago not to offer false hope. Patients deserved honesty. "What would the program involve?" Madison asked. I turned toward her. "Daily physical therapy, strength training for the upper body, neurological stimulation exercises, assisted standing training once his spine heals enough to support weight." Richard raised an eyebrow. "That sounds intense." "It is." "How long?" "At least a year." The words hung heavily in the air. Richard looked down again at his motionless legs. "A year of therapy just for a 30% chance. Possibly higher if your body responds well," I added. He shook his head slowly. "You always were honest. That's part of the job." For several minutes, no one spoke. I could see the conflict in Richard's expression. Before the accident, he had been a man who solved problems quickly. Business negotiations, construction contracts, financial decisions. Everything in his world had been about efficiency. Now he was facing a challenge that had no quick solution. Recovery from spinal trauma couldn't be rushed. It required patience, humility, persistence. Finally, Richard looked up at me again. "Tell me something honestly." "I always do. If this were anyone else, would you recommend they try?" The question carried more weight than he probably realized, because what he was really asking was whether the effort was worth it. I didn't hesitate. "Yes." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not just saying that because you're here." "No." "Why?" "Because I've seen people recover from worse." That wasn't an exaggeration. Not everyone regained full mobility, but many regained far more independence than doctors initially predicted. Richard absorbed that quietly. Madison finally spoke again. "If he agrees, would you be the one leading the program?" The room grew still, because that was the real question behind everything. Would I become responsible for Richard's rehabilitation? Would I spend the next year working closely with the man who had once destroyed my marriage? Dr. Cole looked at me carefully. The decision was mine. I could recommend another specialist. I could step away entirely. No one would blame me. Even Richard seemed uncertain. You don't have to do that, he said quietly. The words surprised me. You could refer me to someone else. I studied his face for a moment. 3 years ago, Richard Bennett had been a confident businessman who believed he controlled his own future. Now he looked like a man standing at the edge of something frightening. I thought about the patients who had trusted me with their recovery. Marcus, the firefighter, the young mother. Every one of them had walked into my clinic hoping for another chance. And I had never turned someone away simply because their story was complicated. Finally, I answered, I'll help design the program. Richard looked relieved. But before Madison could speak, I added something important. However, you should understand something first. Richard raised his eyebrows. What's that? If we do this, I won't treat you differently because of our past. I wouldn't expect you to. That means the program will be demanding, I said firmly. There will be days when you'll want to quit. He gave a faint smile. That sounds about right. And if you do quit, I continued, I won't chase you. His smile faded slightly. Fair enough. Madison looked between us. So you'll help him? I nodded slowly. Yes. Relief washed across her face, but Richard seemed more thoughtful. Life really is strange, he said quietly. I tilted my head slightly. How so? 3 years ago, you were the woman I walked away from, he said. And now you might be the one helping me stand up again. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my voice calm. Rehabilitation starts next week, I said. And in that moment, our past stopped being the focus. Because the real challenge had only just begun. Richard was discharged from Harborview Medical Center 5 days later. By then, the initial swelling around his spinal cord had stabilized enough for the doctors to begin discussing the next stage of treatment, rehabilitation. The word sounded hopeful in theory, but anyone who had spent time inside a neurological therapy center knew the truth. Rehabilitation is not a miracle. It is work. Relentless, exhausting work. Richard arrived at my clinic the following Monday morning. The Seattle sky was its usual pale gray, and light rain misted the streets outside as Madison helped him maneuver his wheelchair through the front entrance. I watched them through the glass door of my office. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of distance, like I was observing someone else's story. 3 years ago, Richard Bennett had walked confidently into corporate offices and construction sites across Chicago, commanding attention with his sharp suits and confident smile. Now he rolled slowly across the polished floor of a rehabilitation clinic. Life has a way of rewriting people. When Madison noticed me standing nearby, she gave a small nod. Good morning. Morning, I replied. Richard looked up at me. Never thought I'd see your name on the door of a clinic, he said. Above the reception desk, the sign read, Sanchez Neurological Rehabilitation Center. It had taken years of work to build that name. I guess life surprises us, I said calmly. Madison helped position Richard beside one of the therapy platforms. He glanced around the room, taking in the equipment. Parallel bars, balance frames, resistance machines, specialized harness systems used for assisted walking. This place looks serious, he muttered. It is. A few of my other patients were already working with therapists nearby. Some were standing with support frames. Others practiced slow steps between metal bars. The quiet determination in the room was something Richard hadn't experienced yet. Rehabilitation environments are different from hospitals. Hospitals focus on survival. Rehabilitation focuses on rebuilding, and that process can be brutal. I pulled a tablet from the counter and approached Richard. Before we begin, I said I want to explain exactly what your program will look like. Richard folded his arms slightly. I'm listening. Madison moved to stand beside him. Your injury is classified as an incomplete thoracic spinal cord injury, I began. That means the spinal cord wasn't severed completely. Richard nodded slowly. So there's still hope. Yes, I said. But the body needs to relearn how to communicate with itself. I pulled up a diagram on the tablet showing the spinal cord pathways. Think of the nervous system like a highway network. When an injury occurs, many of the lanes become blocked. Richard studied the diagram. So therapy is supposed to reopen those lanes? In a way. Madison looked curious. How? Through repetition. I turned the screen toward them. Movement exercises stimulate nerve pathways. Over time, the brain can sometimes reroute signals through alternative neural connections. Richard frowned. That sounds like a lot of trial and error. It is. And if it doesn't work, I met his gaze directly. Then we focus on maximizing independence in other ways. Richard leaned back slightly in his wheelchair. So this could all lead nowhere. That's a possibility, I said calmly. Madison squeezed his shoulder gently. But it could also work. Richard exhaled slowly. All right. He looked around the therapy room again. So where do we start? I gestured toward the parallel bars. Standing training. He raised an eyebrow. Already. Yes. But I can't move my legs. That's why we assist. Two of my therapists approached with a support harness. Richard watched them with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. This looks like something out of a science experiment, he muttered. More like a training program, I said. With careful coordination, the therapists helped secure the harness around Richard's torso. The system attached to an overhead support rail designed to help patients stand without placing full weight on their legs. Madison stepped back, watching closely. Okay, I said. We're going to help you stand. Richard looked doubtful. You realize I haven't stood in weeks. That's why we're starting now. The therapist slowly adjusted the harness. Richard gripped the metal bars in front of him. Ready, I asked. Not really. Good enough. The harness lifted slightly, redistributing his weight as the therapists guided his legs into position beneath him. For a moment, Richard's arms trembled as he pushed down against the bars. Then slowly, his body rose, standing. Not independently, but upright. Richard stared down at his legs in disbelief. I'm standing. Madison covered her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. You are. Richard laughed quietly. Well, that's something. But the moment didn't last long. After less than 30 seconds, his arms began shaking from the strain. Okay, I said. That's enough for today. The therapist lowered him gently back into the wheelchair. Richard rubbed his shoulders. That felt harder than running a marathon. That's normal, I said. You're using muscles that haven't been active for weeks. Madison wiped her eyes. I can't believe he stood. It's the first step, I explained, not the last. Richard looked at me carefully. You've done this before. Many times. And people actually recover. Some do. He nodded thoughtfully. For the next hour, we worked through the rest of the evaluation exercises. Upper body strengthening, balance training, neural stimulation routines. By the end, Richard looked exhausted. Madison knelt beside his wheelchair. How do you feel? He chuckled weakly, like someone who just got introduced to a very long road. I stepped forward. That road is optional. Richard looked up at me. You mean I could quit? Yes, and you'd be fine with that. I wouldn't chase you. He stared at me for a moment. Then he shook his head. No. Madison smiled softly. No what? No quitting. He looked around the clinic again. I didn't build my company by walking away from hard work. That sounded like the Richard I remembered. Driven, stubborn, but perhaps now a little more humbled. He turned back toward me. Same time tomorrow. I nodded. Same time tomorrow. As Madison pushed his wheelchair toward the door, Richard paused and glanced back. Surely. Yes. He hesitated before speaking. Thank you for giving me a chance to fight for this. I didn't answer right away, because 3 years earlier, Richard Bennett had walked out of my life without looking back. Now he was beginning a journey that might lead him back to his feet. And somehow, I had become part of that journey. Again, over the next several weeks, Richard's rehabilitation became part of my daily routine. Every morning at 9, Madison wheeled him through the doors of the clinic. At first, the sessions were brutally difficult for him. His upper body had to compensate for the loss of strength and coordination in his legs, and even simple exercises drained his energy faster than he expected. I had seen that reaction many times before. People who had once been physically capable often struggled the most when their bodies suddenly stopped cooperating. The frustration could become overwhelming. Richard was no exception. During the first week, he tried to hide how much the exercises exhausted him. But by the second week, his patience began to crack. This is ridiculous, he muttered one afternoon while gripping the parallel bars. Sweat rolled down his forehead as his arms trembled from supporting his weight. You've been standing for 40 seconds, I replied calmly. That's not standing, he said. That's hanging from a metal frame like a puppet. Madison stood nearby, watching anxiously. I didn't argue with him. Instead, I checked the timer. 10 more seconds. Richard exhaled sharply. You're enjoying this. No, I said, but I've seen what happens when people stop trying too soon. The timer beeped. I nodded to the therapists assisting him. They slowly lowered him back into the wheelchair. Richard wiped his face with a towel Madison handed him. 40 seconds, he said quietly. Last week you managed 15, I reminded him. He looked up at me, surprised. Really? Yes, small progress often goes unnoticed by patients themselves. That's why therapists track every detail. Richard leaned back in the chair. All right, I guess that's something. Madison smiled faintly. It is. Over time, the routine began to settle. Monday through Friday, 2-hour therapy sessions filled with standing training strength exercises and neurological stimulation drills. Some days went well. Other days felt like setbacks. But slowly Richard's body began adapting. His upper body strength improved. His balance while supported in the harness grew steadier. And occasionally during stimulation exercises, faint muscle responses appeared in his legs. They were small, barely noticeable, but they were real. One afternoon, about 6 weeks into the program, I noticed something unusual during one of those sessions. Richard was seated on the therapy table while I applied electrical stimulation pads along the muscles in his lower legs. These devices send small signals through the muscles to encourage neural activation. Normally the response is minimal, but that day when the stimulation began, Richard frowned. "Did you just see that?" he asked. I looked down at his leg. His calf muscle had twitched. Not a reflex, a voluntary twitch. "Try again," I said. Richard focused intensely, staring at his leg as if willing it to move. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, barely visible, the muscle contracted again. Madison gasped softly. "Oh my God," I kept my voice calm. "That's a good sign." Richard looked stunned. "I did that." "Yes." He laughed quietly. "Well, that's the first time my leg has listened to me in weeks." It wasn't walking. It wasn't even close. But it was proof that his nervous system was still capable of reconnecting. That evening, after Richard and Madison left the clinic, I sat in my office reviewing the therapy notes. The twitch had been small, but medically significant. Recovery from spinal injuries often begins exactly that way. Tiny signals, gradually strengthening over time. Still, progress never follows a straight line. Some days later, Richard experienced one of the lowest moments of his recovery. It happened during an assisted standing session. The harness supported most of his weight as he gripped the parallel bars. We'd been trying to shift weight between his legs, an exercise designed to retrain the nervous system. But his body refused to cooperate. After several attempts, his arms gave out and the therapists lowered him back into the wheelchair. Richard slammed his hand against the armrest. "This is pointless." Madison looked startled. "Richard, I've been doing this for weeks," he snapped. "And what do I have to show for it?" I crossed my arms calmly. "You stood for 2 minutes today. That's nothing. It's progress." Richard shook his head angrily. "You're just saying that because it's your job." The frustration in his voice echoed through the therapy room. Some of the other patients glanced over briefly. Madison leaned closer to him. "You're doing better than you think." "No," he said bitterly, "I'm not." Then he looked at me. "Be honest, Shirley. What if this never works?" I didn't soften the truth. "That's possible." The words hung in the air. Richard stared at the floor. "So I could spend a year doing this and still end up in this chair?" "Yes." Madison squeezed his hand. "But you could also walk again." Richard didn't respond. Instead, he stared at his legs. For a moment, the confident businessman I once knew seemed completely gone. In his place was a man confronting the limits of his own body. After a long silence, he finally spoke again. "I used to think control was everything." Madison frowned. "What do you mean?" "In business, if something goes wrong, you fix it," Richard said quietly. "You throw money at the problem. Hire experts change strategy." He gestured toward his legs. "But this doesn't care about money." "No," I said gently. "It doesn't." He leaned back in the chair. "For the first time in my life, I can't force something to happen. That realization is one of the hardest parts of spinal recovery. The body heals at its own pace. No shortcuts. No negotiations. Only persistence." I stepped closer to him. "You asked me earlier what happens if recovery fails." Richard looked up. "Yes." I met his eyes. "Then we adapt." "How?" "Wheelchair independence, mobility training, strength conditioning." Richard sighed. "That's not the life I imagined." "Very few people imagine this life," I said. "But they still learn how to live it." Madison nodded quietly beside him. After another moment of silence, Richard spoke again. "Let's continue." Madison blinked. "You mean today?" "Yes." I raised an eyebrow. "You're sure?" Richard nodded slowly. "If I quit every time something got hard, my company would have collapsed years ago." That stubborn determination returned to his voice. And despite everything that had happened between us, I recognized it, because that same determination had once helped build the life we used to share. "All right," I said. Let's keep going. As the therapist helped Richard back into the harness, I realized something unexpected. 3 years ago, I believed the story between Richard and me had ended. But now in this rehabilitation room filled with parallel bars and therapy equipment, the story was still unfolding, and none of us yet knew where it would lead. By the 3rd month of Richard's rehabilitation, something began to change, not just in his body, but in his attitude. Recovery from spinal injuries rarely follows a straight line. Some weeks bring visible progress. Others feel like nothing but repetition and frustration. But around the beginning of the 3rd month, subtle improvements started appearing more frequently. Richard could now stand in the harness for nearly 5 minutes. His arms no longer shook violently from exhaustion after each session. And during stimulation therapy, muscle contractions in his legs had grown noticeably stronger. It still wasn't walking, but it was movement. And movement meant possibility. One rainy afternoon, Richard sat at the edge of the therapy table while I reviewed his latest progress notes. Madison stood nearby, watching him carefully. "You moved your left foot twice today," I said. Richard looked down. I barely felt it. "That's normal," I replied. "The brain is still relearning the pathway." Madison smiled. "That's amazing." Richard shrugged slightly. "I guess." But I could see the change in his expression. 3 months ago, he had arrived at the clinic skeptical and defensive. Now there was something else in his eyes. Hope. He didn't say it out loud, but it was there. "Try again," I said, placing my hand lightly against his ankle. Richard focused. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then his foot shifted forward a fraction of an inch. Madison gasped. "You did it." Richard stared at his leg. "I actually did that." "Yes," I said. He looked up at me. "That's more than a twitch." "It is." Madison wiped away tears. 3 months ago, you couldn't move at all." Richard nodded slowly. "Yeah." Then he leaned back, slightly thoughtful. "You know something strange?" "What?" Madison asked. He looked around the therapy room. "I used to think my company was the hardest thing I ever built." I crossed my arms. "And now?" He gestured toward the parallel bars. "This." Madison laughed softly. "That's probably true." Richard looked at me again. "You push people harder than most trainers would. That's part of rehabilitation." "Does everyone complain about it as much as I do?" "Most patients complain more." He smiled faintly. "Well, that's comforting." Over the following weeks, the improvements continued. They were slow, sometimes frustratingly slow, but they were real. One afternoon during assisted standing training, something unexpected happened. Richard was positioned between the parallel bars, the harness supporting part of his weight. The therapist stood nearby, ready to catch him if necessary. "Shift your weight to the left," I instructed. He followed the command carefully. "Now move your right leg forward." Richard hesitated. "I'll fall." "You won't," I said calmly. Madison watched nervously from the side. Richard took a deep breath. Then he tried. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, his right foot slid forward several inches. Not dragged. Moved. Madison covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Richard stared down in shock. "Did I just—" "Yes," I said quietly. "You just took a step." The room went completely silent. Because that moment, the first step, is the milestone every spinal rehabilitation patient dreams about. Richard looked up at me, disbelief filling his face. "I haven't walked in months. You just started again." Madison began crying openly. Richard shook his head slowly. I thought that might never happen." "It's only the beginning," I reminded him. "But it's a good beginning." He laughed softly, overwhelmed. "I never thought I'd be this excited about moving my foot 6 inches. Madison wiped her eyes. "I did." Over the next few days, that small step became the focus of every session. Step training, balance drills, weight shifting exercises. Each attempt grew slightly stronger, still assisted, still fragile, but undeniably real. One evening, after a long session, Richard sat in his wheelchair catching his breath, while Madison grabbed his jacket. The clinic had already emptied of most patients. The quiet room felt almost peaceful. Richard looked at me thoughtfully. "You know something?" "What?" "If this accident hadn't happened, I never would have seen your clinic." "That's true." He glanced around. "You built something impressive here." "Thank you." He hesitated before continuing. "I didn't realize how much you had accomplished." I shrugged slightly. "Life keeps moving." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, it does." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something unexpected. "You seem happier." The observation caught me off guard. "Happier than when we were married." The blunt honesty of the statement hung in the air. I considered my answer carefully. "I'm more at peace." He nodded. I can see that. Madison returned, then helping him prepare to leave. As she pushed his wheelchair toward the door, Richard paused. Tomorrow, he said. Yes, I want to try walking again. Madison smiled. You will. Richard looked back at me, and this time, maybe a little farther. I nodded. That's the goal. As the door closed behind them, I stood quietly in the empty therapy room. 3 years ago, I believed Richard Bennett had taken the best part of my life with him when he left. But standing there now, watching the clinic I had built and the patients I had helped recover, I realized something important. Sometimes losing everything forces you to build something even stronger. And strangely enough, the man who once broke my heart was now walking again because of the life I built without him. But the most surprising part of this story was still waiting ahead. By the 4th month of rehabilitation, Richard's progress had reached a stage that once seemed almost impossible. He was walking, not independently yet, and certainly not smoothly. The walker still supported much of his balance, and every step required intense concentration. But the difference between where he started and where he stood now was undeniable. 4 months earlier, Richard Bennett had arrived at my clinic unable to move his legs. Now he could cross nearly half the therapy room with careful steps. Each movement was slow, measured, but real. One quiet afternoon, the clinic was nearly empty except for a few patients finishing their sessions. Outside, Seattle rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside the therapy room, Richard gripped the walker firmly while Madison stood nearby. All right, I said calmly. Let's try again. Richard took a deep breath. Same distance as yesterday. Same distance. He nodded and shifted his weight forward. His first step landed carefully. Then another, and another. The walker scraped softly across the polished floor as he moved. Madison held her breath. After about 10 steps, Richard paused. His arms trembled slightly from the effort. You're doing fine, I said. He nodded, focusing on the floor. 3 more steps, then 2. Finally, he stopped near the wall and leaned heavily on the walker. Madison clapped softly. That was farther than yesterday. Richard wiped sweat from his forehead. I think my legs are starting to remember what they're supposed to do. That's exactly what's happening, I said. He slowly turned around and walked back toward the therapy table. The return trip took longer, but he completed it. When he finally sat down, Madison handed him a towel. You're incredible, she said. Richard laughed weakly. No, I'm stubborn. Madison smiled. That too. As the therapist began putting away equipment, Richard looked around the clinic quietly. You know something, he said. What Madison asked. I used to believe success meant building bigger projects every year. He glanced at the walker beside him. Now it means walking across a room. Madison squeezed his hand. That's still success. He looked at me then. Actually, it's something bigger than that. I raised an eyebrow slightly. What do you mean? Richard leaned back in the chair. For the first time in my life, I had to rely on other people. That's not unusual, I said. For most people it is, he replied. Madison tilted her head. You've always had help. Yes, Richard said quietly, but I was the one in control. He gestured toward his legs. This took that away. The honesty in his voice was surprising. 3 years ago, Richard had been a man who believed control defined his success. Now he was confronting the reality that some things in life can't be controlled, only endured. After a moment, he looked back at me again. I never thanked you properly. You don't need to. I do. Madison nodded beside him. He really does, Richard continued. You had every reason to walk away from this. I shrugged slightly. I didn't see it that way. He frowned. Why not? The answer came easier than I expected. Because helping people walk again is what I do. Richard studied my face. But I'm not just another patient. No, I admitted. You're not. Madison watched the exchange quietly. Then Richard said something I didn't expect. I owe you more than an apology. The room fell silent. Madison looked down. 3 years of history hung between us. The marriage, the betrayal, the divorce. Finally, Richard spoke again. When I left Chicago, I convinced myself it was the right decision. I didn't respond. He continued quietly. I told myself I deserved a different life. Madison looked uncomfortable but didn't interrupt. Richard shook his head slowly. But lying in a hospital bed, unable to move, gives you a lot of time to think. He looked at his hands. I realized something. What's that? I asked. I spent years chasing success while ignoring the people who helped me build it. His voice softened. And you were the biggest part of that. The admission hung in the air. Madison squeezed his arm gently. Richard turned toward me again. I'm sorry, Shirley. The words were simple, but sincere. 3 years ago, I had imagined hearing that apology many times. In those early months after the divorce, I had replayed countless imaginary conversations in my mind. But standing there now listening to him say it didn't feel the way I once expected. The anger I once carried had faded long ago. All that remained was perspective. "Thank you," I said calmly. Richard seemed relieved. Madison smiled faintly. Then Richard asked something unexpected. "Can I try something?" "What?" I said. He pointed toward the walker. "One more walk." Madison blinked. "You're tired." "I know." He looked at me. "But I want to see if I can go farther." I nodded toward the therapists. They repositioned the walker in front of him. Richard stood slowly. His legs trembled slightly from the earlier effort, but determination filled his expression. Step, step, step. The walker moved forward carefully. Madison followed beside him. This time he didn't stop at the halfway mark. 10 steps, 12, 15. By the time he reached the opposite wall, Madison was crying again. Richard laughed breathlessly. "I think that's a record." "It is," I said. He turned slowly and walked back toward us. When he finally sat down again, exhaustion covered his face, but so did pride. "I guess I'm not done fighting yet." Madison kissed his cheek. "You never were." Richard looked at me one last time. "Whatever happens next, thank you for giving me the chance to fight." I nodded quietly, because in that moment, something important became clear. 3 years earlier, Richard Bennett had broken my heart. But now, helping him stand again had given both of us something unexpected. Closure. And perhaps a second kind of freedom. 6 months after Richard first rolled through the doors of my clinic, something happened that none of us had dared to predict at the beginning. He walked in, not in a wheelchair, not pushed by Madison, but on his own 2 feet. The walker was still there, of course. His balance wasn't strong enough yet to move without it, and every step still required concentration. But the difference between the man who had arrived half a year earlier and the man standing in front of me now was undeniable. That morning, the clinic was already busy when the front door opened. One of my therapists looked up first. "Shirley," she said quietly, "you might want to see this." I stepped out of my office, and there he was. Richard Bennett stood near the entrance, gripping his walker while Madison stood beside him, smiling through tears. For a moment, I simply stared, because I remembered the day he had arrived months earlier, frustrated, angry, convinced recovery might never happen. Now he stood upright. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but undeniably standing. "Well," Richard said with a tired grin, "I figured it was time to stop making an entrance in a wheelchair." Madison laughed softly. "He insisted on walking in today." I stepped closer. "You shouldn't push yourself too fast." "I know," he said. "But today felt important." I nodded. It was important. Not just for him, but for everything he had endured to reach that moment. We moved into the therapy room as usual, though the energy felt different that day. Other patients noticed immediately. In rehabilitation clinics, people quietly celebrate each other's progress because everyone understands how hard those victories are to earn. One of the construction workers who had been training in the corner raised his fist. "Looking good, man," Richard chuckled. "Don't jinx it." Madison helped him settle into the therapy area. "Let's see what you can do today," I said. Richard nodded. He positioned the walker carefully. Then he began moving forward. Step, step, step. The movement was still slow, but far smoother than it had been weeks earlier. His legs responded more naturally now. Muscle memory had begun returning. By the time he reached the center of the room, even I had to admit something. He had surpassed my early expectations. When he finished the exercise and sat down, he looked exhausted but satisfied. "I think I'm finally getting the hang of this." Madison squeezed his hand. "You never stopped trying." Richard looked around the room quietly. "You know what's strange?" What I asked. If the accident hadn't happened, I probably never would have slowed down long enough to see how much I was missing. Madison tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Richard looked at her first. For years, I thought success meant building bigger projects. He gestured around the clinic. "But this," he paused, "this is real success." Madison smiled softly. Then he turned toward me. "I spent decades believing money and ambition were the most important things." I folded my arms lightly. "And now," Richard glanced down at his legs. "Now I realize something." "What?" "Being able to stand up again is worth more than every building my company ever constructed." Madison laughed gently. "I think that's a good perspective." The therapy session ended earlier than usual that day. Richard had pushed himself hard enough already. As Madison helped him toward the door, he paused. Surely, yes. He hesitated briefly. I meant what I said before. About what? About the apology. I nodded. I know. He continued. You didn't just help me walk again. He looked around the clinic. You helped me understand something I should have realized years ago. What's that? That sometimes losing everything is the only way to see what actually matters. Madison squeezed his arm again. Richard smiled faintly. I'm not the same man I was 3 years ago. No, I said. You're not. And strangely enough, I believed that. Because hardship has a way of reshaping people. Some grow bitter. Others grow wiser. Richard, it seemed, had finally begun to grow. Madison pushed the door open. We'll see you tomorrow. I nodded. Same time. Richard gave a small wave as they stepped outside. Then they were gone. The clinic slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Therapy sessions resumed. Machines hummed quietly. Patients practiced their exercises. But for a moment I stood near the window watching the rain fall over the Seattle streets. 3 years earlier, Richard Bennett had walked away from my life believing he had found something better. And for a long time I believed his departure had destroyed everything. But standing there now, I realized something important. The life I built after that loss had become something stronger than the one I had before. My clinic, my patients, my independence. None of it would have existed if I had stayed the same woman he left behind. Sometimes the most painful endings lead to unexpected beginnings. Richard's accident forced him to rebuild his life, but in a strange way, so had the divorce. And perhaps that was the real lesson behind everything that happened. Not revenge, not regret, but growth. Because sometimes the people who hurt us the most unknowingly push us toward the life we were meant to build. And in the end, helping Richard stand again didn't reopen old wounds. It closed them. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never asked to learn. Sometimes those lessons arrive through heartbreak, sometimes through loss, and sometimes through the very people who once hurt us the most. When Richard left me for a younger woman, I believed my life had been shattered beyond repair. 27 years of marriage disappeared in what felt like a single moment. But what I didn't understand back then was that endings don't always destroy us. Sometimes they redirect us. The pain pushed me to rebuild my life in ways I never imagined. It forced me to discover strength, independence, and purpose that had been buried beneath years of routine. And when fate unexpectedly brought Richard back into my life, I had a choice. I could hold on to bitterness, or I could move forward with compassion. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what someone did. It's about refusing to let the past control who you become. Helping Richard recover didn't erase the betrayal, but it reminded me that who we choose to be matters more than what others have done to us. So I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have helped him? Would you have walked away or given someone who once hurt you a second chance? Tell me in the comments. I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that healing and growth are always possible, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about revenge. They're about resilience and the strength it takes to move forward.